The desert did not forgive easily, but it had always respected Taza. He moved across the sandstone ridges like a shadow born from the earth itself. Quiet as dusk, solitary as a hawk drifting on a wind that never touched the ground. To the Apache, he was a scout of rare instinct, a man whose senses were sharp enough to hear danger approaching long before it showed its teeth. To outsiders, he was a myth, a warrior who appeared and vanished exactly when needed, leaving no trace behind. But myths, like men, could be lonely. Taza had returned to his people after nearly 2 years of tracking raiders far beyond their borders, hunting threats no one else dared to face. And though his arrival should have been celebrated, though the fires should have burned brighter for a warrior who protected his homeland, he walked into a silence he had crafted for himself. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, whispering his name as if afraid to speak it aloud. Elders nodded respectfully, but their eyes held questions. Will he stay this time, or disappear again like smoke? No one asked where he had been. No one dared ask why he had left in the first place, because every Apache knew that Taza carried grief the way others carried weapons, always strapped to his side, always ready to bleed if touched. Years ago, before the raids, before the long nights alone on the mesa cliffs, he had belonged to a family, a brother, a woman promised to him, a life he believed he deserved. But storms, the kind made of bullets and fire, had stolen that world. And when the ashes settled, he was the only one who remained. Since that day, he had chosen to stand alone. Better to be unneeded. Better to love no one. Better to lose nothing again. So when he returned, he accepted the small nods and polite welcomes, but refused the invitations to join evening circles or share meals. Instead, he vanished into the high ridges before dawn. Hunting, scouting, patrolling, anything to keep moving so his memories could not catch him. It was on one of those aimless dawn wanderings that he paused and looked back at the village spread below the cliffs. Smoke curled gently from the cooking fires. The sounds were faint but warm, a mother singing, men preparing their horses, a few children arguing over something unimportant, a home, a life, one he no longer knew how to step into. Taza adjusted the belt across his chest, worn from years of travel. The leather was cracked, the metal buckle scarred. It was a belt he had made himself long ago, before he had lost everything. He had kept it as a reminder, not of love, but of the man he should have been and never became. "My heart is strong," he muttered to the rising sun, as if it needed convincing, but the wind returned only silence. The truth was harsher. Taza was tired. Not from the hundreds of miles he had walked or the dangers he had survived, but from the weight of being unbreakable. The weight of being the silent protector who asked nothing, needed nothing, wanted nothing. His people admired him, but no one knew him. Taza believed it was better that way. Loneliness was easier than letting someone close enough to see the cracks under his armor. Pride kept him upright, kept him distant, kept him breathing. But pride could not warm him at night. And fate, quiet, ruthless fate, was already carrying someone toward him who would change everything he thought he deserved. A woman who would see through the silence he hid behind. A woman whose presence would shatter the walls he had built. But for now, Taza stood alone, unaware that his life was about to collide with hers in a way neither could have prepared for. Alara had been riding for 3 days, when she finally saw the distant line of hills where the Apache lands began. Her horse, a dust-colored mare with tired eyes, stumbled with every step, but Alara urged her forward gently. The world behind her had already taken too much. She would not let it take her future too. Her dress was torn from travel, her boots cracked from miles of unforgiving ground. But none of that compared to the weight she carried inside, a heavy, invisible shame she could not scrub from her skin no matter how many rivers she crossed. Ilara hadn't done anything wrong, but truth rarely mattered in places where whispers traveled. Faster than justice. It began 6 months earlier, when she started working at the general store in a small frontier town called Dry Willow. She had gone there to escape a life that had fallen apart piece by piece. A sick mother, a father taken by fever, debts she didn't know how to pay. She wanted a clean start, something quiet, something honest. But one man ruined everything. A wealthy rancher with a cruel reputation decided she should belong to him. When she refused, he didn't take the rejection lightly. Within a week, the town was flooded with lies that she was shameless, that she tempted married men, that she was untrustworthy, immoral, dangerous. People she had greeted kindly now crossed the street to avoid her. Women whispered behind their fans. Men looked at her with hunger or disgust. Never respect. The town preacher told her she should leave before she brought more shame upon herself. Shame? For what? For saying no to a man who thought he owned everything he looked at? But Dry Willow didn't care about her truth. It cared about the rancher's money. The day she left, someone had thrown a stone at her horse. Another woman, one she had helped many times, spat at her feet. Ilara rode away with her chin held high, pretending the tears on her face were just dust caught in the wind. She rode toward the only place she had ever heard outsiders speak of with a mix of superstition and fear, the Apache lands. Not because she believed the stories, but because they were unclaimed by men like the rancher. Out there, she thought, maybe she could live quietly. Maybe she could disappear until her heart remembered how to beat without hurting. But hope was fragile, and the desert was cruel. By the time she reached the ridges, her lips were cracked and her head felt too light. She had eaten almost nothing. Her water skin held only a few drops. She kept telling herself she just needed to make it over the next hill. Then the next. When she finally reached the plateau and saw the open land below, she whispered, "Please." Just a little more, as if begging her own body not to give up. Her mare shuddered beneath her and stopped. Ilara patted its neck with trembling fingers. "It's all right. I'll walk." She slid off, knees buckling as she hit the ground. She tried to steady herself, but the world tilted. The sky spun. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed a hand to her forehead, willing herself not to faint. Not here. Not when I'm so close, but she didn't make it another 10 steps. The heat, the hunger, the weight she carried finally dragged her down. Her legs trembled, then folded beneath her. She fell to the earth, dust rising gently around her like a blanket of gold. She didn't feel herself hit the ground. She didn't hear her horse whinny in alarm. She didn't see the tall figure watching her from the ridge above. Taza had been returning from his morning scouting when he did. Saw her collapse. A stranger. An outsider. Alone. He hesitated, a warrior's instinct warring. With a lonely man's heart, Ben began climbing down toward her. Ilara did not know it yet, but the moment she hit the ground was the moment her life stopped falling apart and began to change. When Ilara opened her eyes, the world felt too soft to be the desert. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had died and woken in some place kinder than the life she had run from. There was shade overhead, the scent of cedar, and the faint sound of running water nearby. Her body felt weightless, as if someone had lifted her from the heat and laid her somewhere cool. But when she tried to sit up, a deep, unfamiliar voice spoke from the shadows of the shelter. "Move slowly," it said. "Your strength has not returned." Ilara froze. Her hands instinctively curled into fists, though she was too weak to defend herself. She blinked until her vision steadied, and that was when she saw him. Man sat cross-legged near the entrance of the small canyon alcove, where sunlight spilled through like a warm curtain. His posture was still as stone, but his eyes, They watched her with a strange mix of caution and intensity. Not hunger, not judgment, just a deep, unreadable alertness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in leather and beadwork that marked him unmistakably as Apache. Long black hair fell loosely over his shoulders, and a faint scar ran along his jaw, the kind earned in a life that knew danger too intimately. Alara swallowed hard. "Did you bring me here?" she whispered. The man nodded once, nothing more. "Why?" Instead of answering, he reached beside him and held out a small water gourd. "Drink." His tone was firm, not unkind. A command issued because he knew she needed it, not because he sought power over her. Alara hesitated. In Dry Willow, hesitation had kept her alive. Trust was a luxury she had long ago stopped affording strangers. He noticed. "If I meant you harm," he said quietly, "you would not have awakened." There was no threat in his voice, only fact. Steady, honest. She took the gourd. Her hands trembled so violently that some of the water spilled, but she drank greedily until her breathing steadied. She returned it to him with a whisper of thanks. Barely audible, the man studied her for another long moment, his dark eyes taking in her exhausted posture, her travel-worn clothes, the desperation hidden beneath her thin composure. Finally, he spoke. "You rode far." Alara looked away. "Far enough, I hope." He didn't ask from what. He didn't press. He didn't look at her like the townspeople had looked at her in Dry Willow, as though she deserved their scorn, as though shame clung to her like a stain. Instead, he simply waited. That patience unnerved her more than cruelty ever could. "What is your name?" Alara asked, her voice barely stronger than a breath. "Taza." She repeated it softly, letting the syllables settle on her tongue. It sounded like the kind of name that carried the weight of storms and courage in equal measure. "Taza," she said. "Thank you for helping me." He didn't nod this time, didn't soften, but something shifted in his expression, something almost invisible, a quiet recognition that her gratitude came from a place deeper than politeness. She was silent a moment, then asked, "Why me? You don't even know who I am." Taza turned his gaze toward the entrance, watching the wind stir the dust outside. "You were alone," he said. "And falling." Alara pressed her lips together. No one had said anything like that to her in a long time, not without scorn behind it. Her chest tightened unexpectedly, not with fear, but with something close to relief. She studied him in return now, the rigid way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the loneliness etched into every line of his posture. A man carved from silence, not because he wanted to be, but because something had taught him that silence was safer than being known. She understood that too well. Their eyes met again. Neither looked away this time. It was not a spark of romance. Not yet. It was an unspoken recognition. Two wounded souls who did not know each other's stories, yet somehow felt the shape of the other's pain. For the first time since leaving Dry Willow, Alara felt the faintest flicker of safety, not because she trusted him, but because he looked at her as if she was real, not ruined. And Taza, though he didn't know why, did not look away. For the rest of that day, neither Taza nor Alara spoke much. Words seemed unnecessary. The air between them carried more weight than any conversation could. Yet every glance, every subtle movement, was a language of its own. Alara watched him carefully as he moved about the alcove, inspecting the small fire pit, checking the water she had sipped earlier, adjusting the simple shelter they had found. Each motion was deliberate, measured, like a man who had spent years perfecting the art of self-control. She had expected a savior to be warm, to reach out in reassurance, but Taza was none of those things. He was steady, solid, and painfully silent. She wanted to speak. She wanted to ask why he had helped her, why he had not left her in the dust to die like everyone else might have. But the words died on her lips. She had been taught that curiosity, that boldness, could be dangerous, and Taza seemed like a man who could easily punish both. Instead, she studied him quietly, noticing the faint scars along his forearms, the way the sunlight touched his dark hair, the subtle tension in his jaw that spoke of battles fought both outside and within. Taza, for his part, avoided her eyes whenever possible. It was not cruelty. It was defense. His pride, carefully honed over years of solitude, warned him that attachment could be a trap. To care was to risk, and he had long ago decided that risk was too costly. Loneliness had become a shield, and he wore it as naturally as the leather straps across his chest. Yet, despite the wall he maintained, Ilara could feel something shifting in the space between them. Her presence, quiet and persistent, seemed to touch a part of him that he had forgotten existed. A flicker of something he neither welcomed nor wanted. Vulnerability. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of juniper and dry earth. Birds circled overhead, calling to each other in a language he understood but could never fully speak aloud. Ilara finally spoke, her voice soft, careful. "Do you always live like this? Alone?" Taza did not answer immediately. He continued to arrange the small fire pit, shifting rocks, tracing the rim of the hearth with his fingers as though counting invisible lines in the sand. When he finally looked at her, his gaze was steady, unreadable. "Not always," he said. His voice was low, almost rough, but calm. "I choose it now." Ilara nodded slowly, sensing both honesty and a hidden sorrow in those words. She wanted to ask him why, to demand the story that he was guarding so fiercely, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she let herself sit near the edge of the alcove, close enough to feel his presence, far enough to honor the space he had built around himself. The sun dipped lower, painting the canyon walls in hues of gold and amber. Shadows stretched long across the rocky floor, and the silence between them grew heavier, almost tangible. Ilara's heart ached with a strange mix of hope and despair, hope that perhaps this man could see her as she truly was, and despair at the thought that his pride might never allow him to embrace anything beyond solitude. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "It feels safer to be with you than I've felt in months." Taza's expression did not change, yet the faintest shift in his posture betrayed the stirrings of something unfamiliar, awareness, maybe even caution. He did not speak, but the air between them thickened with unspoken acknowledgement. Neither had given permission for attachment. Neither had confessed a need for the other. And yet, in that quiet canyon alcove, a fragile connection had begun to form, fragile but undeniable. For Taza, the wall around his heart remained intact, but he now realized it was not impervious. For Ilara, the long journey of running and hiding had given her courage she hadn't known she possessed. They were two solitary souls, brought together by fate and circumstance, each guarding wounds the other could not yet touch. And in that delicate balance of silence and distance, the first threads of trust, tentative, fragile, and essential, began to weave themselves into the tapestry of their shared story. The night fell, cool and vast, but neither feared it. There was comfort in the shared solitude, a quiet acknowledgement that for the first time, neither had to be completely alone. The desert had a way of hiding danger in its beauty. Taza had felt it for years, a whisper in the wind, the sudden screech of a hawk, the heat shifting unnaturally before a storm broke. That evening, as the sun dipped beneath the ridges, he noticed it first in the sky. Clouds, heavy and dark, rolled in faster than nature seemed capable of moving. The wind began to stir, carrying a dry chill that pricked the skin and raised goosebumps along his arms. Alara, sitting near the edge of the alcove, noticed it too. She shivered slightly and pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Is that a storm?" she asked, her voice small against the sudden roar of the wind. Tiazia didn't answer immediately. He rose, scanning the canyon opening with sharp eyes. "Yes, we should move deeper into the alcove. Shelter before it arrives." Together, they scrambled toward a narrower section of the canyon where the rocks formed a small overhang. It wasn't much, but it would keep them from the worst of the wind and rain. As they settled under the overhang, the first streaks of lightning split the sky, followed by thunder that rattled the stone walls around them. Alara pressed herself closer to the rock, her knees drawn up. She could hear her own heartbeat in the chaos, rapid and unsteady. But it wasn't just fear of the storm. The silence and distance that had defined her life for months had left her unprepared for a quiet, towering man who now shared her space. Taza, sitting across from her, remained calm, almost unshakable, though he too felt the storm in his bones. Unlike Alara, he had faced lightning and wind countless times on open plains and ridges. He had survived ambushes, injuries, and nights without shelter. But tonight was different. Tonight, he felt the storm echoing the turmoil he had carried inside for so long. Alara finally spoke, her voice soft and tentative. I've never seen anything like this." Taza didn't respond at first. He watched the clouds swirl overhead, watching the rain begin to streak the canyon walls, tracing patterns that would vanish within seconds. Then, quietly, he said, "The desert tests you. It shows you what you can endure." She looked at him, startled by the gentleness in his tone. All her life, people had spoken down to her, judged her, or outright ignored her. But here, under this storm, a man spoke to her as though she could endure, as though he expected her to survive and believed she would. The wind howled louder, rattling loose stones around them. Alara hugged her knees tighter, feeling small and vulnerable, a sensation she had long avoided. She wanted to speak, to ask him why he helped her, why he didn't leave her to the elements. But fear and pride tangled her tongue. Then Taza shifted closer. Not enough to invade her space, but enough to offer presence. He didn't reach out. He didn't offer words. Instead, he simply exhaled, letting the sound of his breathing blend with the storm. Alara realized it was a lifeline. Not a promise, not a reassurance, just proof that she was not alone. Minutes passed. Hours, perhaps. The storm raged around them, relentless, but the alcove provided its own shelter. Lightning struck far ridges in the distance, illuminating Taza's dark silhouette against the jagged stone walls. Ilara's eyes traced the lines of his face, strong, unyielding, and yet there was a trace of something else in his gaze, something vulnerable, almost human. At some point, she felt the first flicker of trust creep into her chest. Not the blind trust she had been taught to give in the past, not the desperate hope that left one open to ruin, but a quiet, cautious trust that allowed her to lean toward him in silence. The storm continued through the night, but inside the alcove, something shifted. The fear that had gripped Alara for months began to loosen, and for the first time in a long while, Taza allowed himself to feel a subtle comfort, a presence without demand, a warmth without words. They didn't speak again that night, but neither were alone. And in that small alcove, battered by the desert storm, two solitary souls began the delicate process of learning how to exist side by side, without fear, without shame, and without walls that could not eventually fall. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the desert washed in a pale, silvery light. Rain-soaked rocks glimmered, and small puddles reflected the first rays of sunlight like shards of glass. The wind had softened to a gentle sigh, carrying the scent of wet earth and juniper. The world seemed quiet, almost reverent, as if it knew something fragile had begun between them overnight. Alara sat on a flat stone near the small alcove, watching Taza move about with the ease of a man familiar with the land. He was cleaning his gear now, washing dust and dirt from the edges of his worn leather armor. The movement was mechanical, precise, yet there was something softened in the way his shoulders relaxed under the clear morning sky. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at him. Her chest tightened with an emotion she had not felt in months, not just fear or exhaustion, but something that trembled closer to hope. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. She had survived Dust Willow, she had crossed endless miles. And yet standing here beside him, she felt more exposed than ever. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was a whisper, almost afraid of disturbing the fragile balance between them. "Taza, may I?" She trailed off, unsure of the words, unsure if her body and heart could express what her mind feared to admit. Taza looked up, meeting her gaze. There was a hesitation in his eyes, a cautious question, a silent acknowledgement that whatever she intended could either strengthen their fragile trust or shatter it completely. He didn't move closer, didn't speak. He simply waited. Alara swallowed. She took a deep breath, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain and dry leaves. Her hand reached out almost unconsciously and moved toward him. It hovered for a moment, trembling with a mixture of courage and fear, before she finally let it rest lightly on his arm. Demanding, not desperate, but reaching, a small, deliberate gesture that carried everything she had been too afraid to say. "Taza," she whispered again, this time letting the name linger between them. I want to trust you. I want to believe that you see me." The man tensed for a heartbeat, the years of solitude and pride coiling around his chest like iron bands. He had not allowed anyone this close, had not let a single soul brush the edges of the heart he hid beneath discipline and armor. Yet here she was, fragile but unwavering, offering her hand and her trust in the simplest, most fearless way he had ever known. His hand moved slowly, almost reluctantly, to cover hers. The warmth of his skin was grounding, steadying, not intrusive, not commanding, just solid. As if saying silently, "I see you. I will not harm you." Alara closed her eyes briefly, letting herself feel it, the first honest connection she had experienced in months. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. And though neither spoke, the silence held a language of its own. The storm from the night before had passed, but the tempest within both of them was only just beginning. "I've been alone a long time," Taza said quietly, his voice low, rough with disuse but sincere. I do not know how to allow this, how to let someone close." Alara nodded. "Neither do I, but maybe we can learn together." For a long moment, they simply sat there, hands touching, breathing in the quiet of the canyon. Neither needed to speak more. The world outside the alcove, with its judgment, its dangers, and its chaos, seemed distant and unimportant. Here, in this fragile pocket of the desert, two broken souls had found a sliver of understanding, a moment of safety, of acknowledgement, of connection. It was not love yet, not fully, but it was something almost as rare, trust. And in the delicate, unspoken exchange of that morning, both Taza and Alara realized that the walls they had built around themselves, walls forged from fear, pride, and loss, might be starting to crumble. The desert around them was vast and empty. Yet in the quiet aftermath of the storm, they felt, for the first time in months, that they were not entirely alone. The day had grown warmer, the canyon basking in the dry heat of the late morning sun. Taza and Alara had moved closer to the small fire pit, sitting across from each other with a quiet understanding that neither dared to speak aloud. Words, for now, felt unnecessary. The storm had left an invisible mark on both of them, a fragile recognition of shared vulnerability that neither could ignore. Ilara's gaze drifted to the worn leather belt crossing Taza's chest. It was part of the armor he had worn for years, a barrier between himself and the world, a symbol of both protection and isolation. She had seen the scars etched into the leather, the signs of battles and hardships carried silently for decades. In that moment, she felt a daring urge, one that wasn't born of defiance or recklessness, but of a profound need to connect, to bridge the distance that pride and solitude had enforced. Slowly, deliberately, she reached toward him. Her fingers brushed the belt, hesitant at first, then firmer as she met his gaze. Taza froze. The faintest tension ran along his jaw, the kind a warrior carries when facing a moment of uncertainty he cannot control. "Wait," he murmured, his voice low, roughened by years of silence. But there was no anger in it, only caution, a quiet plea. Ilara did not pull back. Instead, she met his eyes with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed before. "Taza, I'm not asking for permission," she whispered softly. "I just want you to see me, to let me touch something real, in you and in me." Her words were fragile, almost breaking, but they carried a weight that surprised them both. She unfastened the buckle of his leather belt slowly, deliberately, letting it fall away. It was an intimate act, yet not in the way one might expect. It was not about power, nor desire, nor conquest. It was a gesture of trust and connection. Taza's hands hovered for a moment, uncertain. He had lived with armor and walls for so long that the idea of letting them down, even partially, was foreign. His eyes softened, though, revealing the shadow of the man who longed for understanding and closeness, even as he had denied himself both for years. Ilara leaned slightly closer, her voice a breath, almost a prayer. "Make me feel worthy. Let me show you that what you've built doesn't have to be all you are." The words hung in the quiet canyon, almost sacred. Taza swallowed, his throat tight, a lifetime of pride and solitude pressing against the fragile moment. He had never been asked to let someone see him this way, not for the sake of understanding, not for the sake of trust. Slowly, hesitantly, he placed his hand over hers. There was warmth, steadiness, and an unspoken acknowledgement. "I will let you in a little, but I do not know how far I can go." Ilara closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the significance of the act. It was not passion, not lust. It was something far more dangerous, far more intimate, the beginning of mutual vulnerability. The first cracks in the walls that had kept them both alone for far too long. The canyon around them remained quiet, the desert stretching vast and endless beyond the alcove. The storm of the night before seemed distant now, a mere memory compared to the tempest that surged within both of them. Taza's voice broke the silence, low and rough but sincere. I do not know how to let this happen. How to let someone see me." "You don't have to," Ilara whispered. "Not yet. Just let me be here." And so, in the quiet heat of the desert morning, two solitary souls began the most delicate dance of all, learning how to trust, learning how to touch without fear, and learning that worthiness is not something earned alone, it is something shared, something recognized in the presence of another heart willing to see you fully, for the first time. Taza felt that perhaps armor could be removed, if only for a moment, without the world collapsing around him. And Ilara realized that courage was not just running from the past, but choosing to reach for someone who had built walls even taller than her own. The moment was silent, fragile, and irreversible. Neither would ever be the same. The afternoon sun had softened, spilling a warm golden light across the canyon walls. Shadows stretched long and slow, following the curves of rock and sand. Taza and Alara remained near the small alcove, their proximity no longer a matter of circumstance but of choice. The act from earlier, the removal of the belt, had created a subtle shift between them, one neither could deny. Taza's hand lingered over hers, warm and steady, but the tension in his shoulders remained. Years of solitude and survival were not so easily cast aside. To admit need, to acknowledge that another could see him fully, went against everything he had trained himself to endure. Yet, as he looked at Alara, her eyes reflecting a mix of courage, vulnerability, and unwavering trust, he realized something that startled him. He wanted her presence, not as a distraction or duty, but as a relief. For the first time, Taza allowed himself to breathe in a way he had not since long before the battles, before the loneliness had taken root. He let the smallest surrender slip through the cracks of his pride, a gentle acceptance that someone could stand near him without fear, without judgment, without demand. Alara noticed immediately. She felt it in the quiet of their shared space, in the subtle relaxation of his posture, in the way his dark eyes softened when they met hers. She had touched him, yes, but more importantly, she had reached the part of him that had been buried beneath years of armor, solitude, and self-reliance. "I've spent so long believing I am unworthy," Taza admitted quietly, almost to himself. "Unworthy of trust, companionship, even of forgiveness for what I have done and lost." Alara pressed her hand lightly over his. "You are worthy," she said softly, "not because of what you have done or what you've lost, but because you are here, because you let me see you, because you are human, and that is enough." The words hung in the air between them like a delicate thread, fragile but undeniable. Taza swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their truth pressing against the walls he had built for decades. Pride had always been his shield, but now he recognized it for what it had been, a barrier between himself and the very human connection he craved. Slowly, he leaned forward, resting his forehead lightly against hers. It was not an act of dominance, nor a claim. It was an offering, vulnerable, careful, and full of unspoken gratitude. Alara leaned in, mirroring him, closing the space that had once seemed impossible to cross. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no rush, no expectation, no demand. The desert outside stretched endless and quiet, the canyon walls absorbing their breaths, their hesitations, and their trust. And in that stillness, Taza felt a profound, almost terrifying relief. "I don't know how to do this," he whispered, voice raw and unpracticed. "But I want to try." "You don't have to know how," Alara said, her thumb brushing lightly over the back of his hand. "I'll help you. We'll learn together." The warmth of her words, combined with her unwavering gaze, finally broke the last threads of resistance he had clung to so desperately. Taza's chest relaxed, his shoulders lowering as if the weight of all his years of solitude had been lifted, if only for a moment. He surrendered not to her, but to the possibility of connection, the potential of trust, the courage to allow someone to be close without fear. Alara smiled faintly, a gentle curve that reached her eyes and softened the edges of all the pain she had carried. The vulnerability she had shared had not been met with judgment, nor indifference, but with the careful, deliberate acceptance of a man learning how to surrender without losing himself. Together, they sat in quiet harmony, letting the silence stretch like a soft blanket. Neither rushed, neither demanded. The storm from days past had left its mark, but it had also left this, a fragile, tender moment of mutual understanding. For Taza, the surrender was more than a gesture. It was the beginning of a transformation, the recognition that strength did not come from solitude alone, but also from allowing someone else to stand beside you. For Alara, it was proof that courage and trust could reach even the most guarded of hearts. and in the golden light of the canyon, two broken souls found the first true measure of worthiness, not in acts of valor or survival, but in the quiet surrender to being seen, truly seen, by another human being. As the sun dipped beneath the canyon ridges, painting the rocks in warm shades of amber and gold, Taza and Alara remained near the small alcove. The day's heat had softened into a gentle evening warmth, and the desert, vast and silent, seemed to pause as if acknowledging the fragile trust forming between them. The events of the day weighed heavily, yet softly, in both their minds. The act of reaching, of touching without demand, had left a lingering intimacy neither fully understood but both sensed deeply. It was not passion in the way that townsfolk might whisper about or misunderstand. It was something far rarer, a mutual acknowledgement of worth, a careful navigation of vulnerability, and the first true step toward healing. Alara tended the small fire, her hands steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. She had been alone for so long, running from whispers, accusations, and judgment. The dessert had been her escape, but it had also left her exhausted, unsure if trust was even possible anymore. Now, sitting here beside a man who did not rush her, who did not expect her to perform or please, she felt a strange and unfamiliar safety. Taza watched her quietly from across the fire, the faint glow casting sharp shadows on his strong features. He was still a man of few words, yet the silence was not cold or distant. It was deliberate, giving space for both of them to exist without pressure. Every subtle movement he made, from adjusting a stone to tending the fire, was careful, mindful, almost protective in its own way. They shared a meal of simple provisions, breaking bread and sipping water. No words were needed to acknowledge the significance of the act. Each gesture, each glance, each pause in the conversation carried weight. They were learning to exist together without fear, to offer presence without expectation. As night fell, the desert transformed. Stars emerged one by one, scattered like diamonds across the deep navy sky. A gentle wind whispered through the canyon, rustling leaves and carrying the scent of wet earth from the recent storm. In the quiet darkness, Taza finally spoke, his voice low and unpracticed. "You have not left," he said, almost as a statement to himself. Alara looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I am here," she said softly. "I will not leave." The simplicity of the words, the steadiness behind them, struck him more profoundly than any battle victory ever could. He realized that she had not come seeking safety for only herself. She had come offering it to him as well, without demand or expectation. For a long moment, they simply watched the fire burn. Alara reached toward him, resting a hand lightly on his arm, not to provoke, not to claim, but to comfort and connect. Taza allowed it, feeling the warmth and reassurance spread through him like sunlight after a long winter. The night passed in quiet harmony. There was no rush to speak, no urgency to act. Each heartbeat, each breath, each shared glance was a step toward healing. They did not need to label the moment or define it. Its meaning was clear in the comfort and trust that grew with each passing hour. Alara leaned slightly against him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. He, in turn, allowed her presence to rest near him, the distance of pride and fear shrinking ever so slightly. Neither had expected this ease, this softness, this connection, but both recognized its value immediately. The desert outside remained vast and untamed, but inside the alcove, time seemed suspended. The storm from days past had left its mark, but it had also created space for something new, the beginning of recovery. The acknowledgement that past shame and solitude need not define them. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the canyon walls, Taza and Alara had learned something vital, that healing is not an act of solitude, but a shared journey. In the quiet night, surrounded by stars and firelight, they had discovered that intimacy could exist without shame, and trust could bloom even amidst the harshest landscapes. For the first time in years, neither was truly alone. Dawn broke over the canyon with a gentle, golden glow, spilling light across the jagged ridges and the small alcove where Taza and Alara had spent the night. The desert was quiet, save for the distant rustle of wind through the juniper and the occasional call of a bird waking to the new day. The storm of the previous days had left the land washed and glimmering, a reflection, perhaps, of the change that had quietly begun in the hearts of the two souls who now shared this fragile space. Taza sat near the fire, the last embers glowing softly at his side. Alara stirred beside him, stretching and brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The intimacy of the previous night lingered like a gentle echo, not a weight, but a promise of connection. A recognition that they had been seen by another human being in a way neither had experienced for years. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the first light of day, and for the first time he felt an openness he had long denied himself. There was no pretense, no guardedness, only the quiet understanding that they had survived not just the desert, not just the storm, but their own fears and pride. "Alara," he said softly, his voice low but steady, "you could leave at any moment. No one would stop you, and yet you stayed." Alara smiled faintly, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and softens the edges of past pain. "I stayed because for the first time, I felt safe. Not because of walls or promises, but because of you. Because we see each other." Taza's chest tightened with an emotion he had not named in years. He had been a man of pride and solitude, convinced that to allow another close was a weakness. Yet here she was, and he realized that strength and vulnerability were not enemies. They could coexist. Trust could be a shield as much as pride had once been. The desert stretched endlessly before them, wide and untamed, yet the vastness felt less lonely now. Together they could walk this land, side by side, not as outcasts, not as broken souls, but as companions who had chosen each other amidst adversity. Taza rose slowly, offering Alara his hand. She took it without hesitation, and the contact, simple and human, held a significance beyond words. In that moment, there were no barriers, no fear, only the quiet acknowledgement that they were no longer alone. They stepped out of the alcove and into the light of the new day. Each step across the sun-warmed rocks felt purposeful. The desert around them, vast and indifferent, now seemed a canvas of possibility rather than a wilderness to survive. "Where will we go?" Alara asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Forward," Taza replied simply. "Together." The words were straightforward, yet they carried the weight of everything they had endured. Loneliness, fear, loss, and the courage it had taken to reach out to another soul. Forward meant leaving behind the past. Yes, but it also meant embracing the uncertainty of life with someone who would stand beside them through it all. As they descended the canyon, hand in hand, the first rays of sunlight caught the glint of Taza's armor and the dust in Alara's hair, casting a golden aura around them. It was as if the desert itself acknowledged their choice, blessing the fragile bond that had been forged through storms, both literal and emotional. Neither spoke much, for words were unnecessary. Every glance, every step, every shared breath communicated the understanding they had slowly cultivated. In the quiet moments, Taza allowed himself to feel something he had not allowed in years: hope. Not just for survival, not just for comfort, but for connection, for belonging. Alara walked beside him, no longer weighed down by shame or judgment. She had reclaimed her worth not through defiance, but through trust and courage. Together, they stepped into the vast, uncharted horizon, two solitary souls who had chosen not to remain alone, who had learned that love, trust, and healing could exist even in the harshest landscapes. And as the sun rose fully over the canyon, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility, Taza and Ilara understood the quiet truth of their journey. They were no longer defined by the past, by pride, or by solitude. They were defined by the choice to stand together, worthy, seen, and finally, fully alive.